Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really provocative question that gets right to the heart of faith. Is the Bible meant to be read like a history book, or is it something else entirely? Something more like a spiritual guide? Okay, let's kick this off with a story that, honestly, shook an entire movement to its core. And it all starts with a confession from one of the very people who was supposed to be defending the Bible's literal historical truth. I mean, just imagine this for a second. You've built your entire career, your whole reputation on one central idea. And then, one day, you stand up and say, I was wrong. That's exactly what happened. This incredible admission came from the founder and former president of the Korean Creation Science Society. So to give you some context, creation science is this movement that basically argues the Bible should be read as a literal history and science textbook. You know, the idea that the Earth is only about 6,000 years old. It really took off in the US as a way to push back against evolution, insisting that every single detail in the Bible is factually accurate. But here's where the story gets really wild. After this founder started looking at the scientific evidence, specifically for carbon dating, he had this huge realization. His life's work was built on a mistake. But when he went back to his own organization and told them, they rejected him. They were terrified that if they admitted just one thing was wrong, the whole thing would come crashing down. So they basically forced him out. He had to leave the very society he founded. Incredible. So the speaker we're looking at today argues that this whole crisis with creation science, it's not just some modern-day squabble. No, he says it points to a much, much deeper problem, an ancient battle, really, over what Scripture is even for. And this is really the core of his entire argument. You've got two ways of reading. On the one hand, there's the historical reading. It's all about literal events, dates, and who's related to whom. This leads to defending physical places, like a temple, and getting bogged down in rigid rules. The speaker calls this the path of the adversary. But then on the other hand, there's this spiritual reading. This is about finding symbolic, inner meaning. It understands that the temple can be a metaphor for the human body. It looks for the principle behind the rule. And this, he says, is the path of Jesus. He's arguing that the mistake creation scientists are making today is the exact same mistake the religious leaders made 2,000 years ago. They were so focused on the literal stuff that they completely missed the spiritual. So we got to be really clear about what he means by adversary, or Satan. He's not talking about some red demon with a pitchfork. No, for him, the adversary is a mindset. It's an approach. It's anyone, he argues, who obstructs God's spiritual purpose by getting stuck on a purely historical, literal reading of the text. So your method of reading can actually put you in opposition to the faith you think you're defending. All right, now let's get into what is maybe the most provocative part of his whole argument. This is where he takes this idea and applies it to one of the most fundamental stories in the Old Testament, really deconstructing it. And the big question is this: were the Israelites who escaped from Egypt an ethnically pure people? Now, if you read it as literal history, the answer is a simple yes. They were the pure-blooded descendants of Abraham. End of story. But, the speaker says, the text itself, if you look closely, tells a very, very different story. Okay, just follow his logic here for a second. Step 1, Pharaoh orders all newborn Hebrew boys to be killed. Step 2, that act, by definition, cuts off the paternal bloodline for an entire generation, right? So, step 3, how do the people survive? Well, Hebrew women would have had children with Egyptian men, which leads to step 4, the group that eventually leaves Egypt couldn't possibly have been pure-blooded. They were inherently of mixed blood. He's saying it's not just a possibility, it was a biological necessity for survival, which makes the whole idea of ethnic purity a kind of fiction. And think about this. When all the males leaving Egypt were commanded to be circumcised, what was that about? In this view, it wasn't a sign of their ethnic purity. It was a legal tool to unite a mixed, diverse group of people under one single new identity. And this just perfectly illustrates his point, right? When you read historically, you get stuck defending a fragile, exclusive identity. But when you read it spiritually, you find this incredible story of inclusion and unity. Okay, so if reading the Bible like a history book is so problematic, what's the alternative? How should we read it? Well, the speaker uses this really beautiful analogy from nature to explain it. He talks about the idea of resurrection, or buhal in Korean. And for him, this isn't some far-off future event. It's an inner transformation that can happen right now. He compares it to a cicada breaking out of its old shell. The old self is shed and a new spiritual self emerges. It's a complete metamorphosis. So when the Bible talks about the first heaven and first earth passing away, he says that's not the planet Earth, that's you. It's your old self, your historical identity, your ego. It's the shell that you have to cast off. Your life as you've known it is kind of like that cicada larva living underground. It's an important stage, but it's not the end of the story. And the new heaven and new earth, well, that emerges from inside you after that first earth is metaphorically burned away. That's the new, resurrected spiritual being. So the whole point of faith, in this view, isn't to just sit around and wait for a new world to appear. It's to actively bring it forth from within yourself through this radical process of transformation. Okay, so why is this so important right now? Well, the speaker argues that this ancient debate over how to read scripture is right at the center of a massive crisis happening in the modern church today. His claim is that a lot of churches just aren't providing this kind of deep spiritual teaching. Instead, they're leaving their members with a really superficial, historical understanding of faith. And this creates a kind of spiritual vacuum. It leaves people who are genuinely hungry for something deeper feeling, well, empty. And here's his critique, point by point. He says that often, pastors aren't really equipped to teach the Bible this deeply, so they end up just repeating dogma instead of encouraging any kind of critical interpretation. The results? Believers who are starving for real meaning aren't being fed. So what do? They start looking for answers outside the traditional church. And this, he says, is turning churches into factories for producing chaff instead of places that actually nurture believers. This lack of deep teaching basically leaves the door wide open for other groups to come in and attract people who are on a genuine spiritual search. So, at the end of the day, the speaker leaves us with a really powerful choice. It comes down to this one question. Is true faith built on defending an unprovable history, or is it about pursuing a deep inner transformation? He basically frames this as the most important decision a person of faith can make, choosing between the outer shell and the inner journey.